Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Making Infrastructure Happen. This episode, we're going to be talking about project delivery under African conditions. Infrastructure projects in Africa do not fail in the financing stage, they fail in the field when the cement doesn't arrive, the rain comes early, and the project schedule meets reality and losses. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this episode. In this episode, Building the Range, we are talking about climate, skill gaps, and the procurement decision that can sink a project before a single foundation is dug. With us today are Mr. Abbass Agbaje, CEO of Impact Crest Consulting and Environmental and Social Safeguard Consultant for the African Development Bank Group, and Mr. Tunde Agoro, a chartered environmentalist and technical director with nearly 2 decades of experience at AECOM, who are Layer, and RPS Group, two practitioners who have seen this up close. So let's get into it. Gentlemen, would you like to share with our audience who are meeting you for the first time? And can you please tell us how you got into your careers as professionals in the climate and energy sector, starting with you, Mr. Abbass Agbaje?
Right. Thank you, Chisom. It's a pleasure to join you on this podcast. Hello, listeners. I am Abbas Agbaje, Managing Director at Impact Crest Consulting, an ESG advisory firm supporting the integration of ESG considerations in project development and business operations across Africa. Well, in terms of how I found myself in this career, it happened fortuitously while in school. Interestingly, a lecturer called me to represent him on an ESI fieldwork. And that was how I got to know about impact assessment. So I had gone in as the ecology specialist. And during the time, we were working on ESIA for a telecommunications project. So we visited various base stations in Lagos, and my job was to take note of the potential impact of the project on, the environment, particularly plants and animals. And so this was my first foray into the world of impact assessment, something I would later come to enjoy doing as we traverse different parts of this country, Nigeria, as well as working in other countries such as Senegal, Ghana, and the Ivory Coast, and more, recently during COVID in Lebanon. So it's been an enjoying one. We see that the work that we do as E&S specialists contributes significantly to sustainable development, ensuring that projects or businesses do not constitute any adverse impact on the environment and operate in a socially responsible manner. So it's a pleasure to join you. Thank you for having me.
It's very, very unusual for people to, come in touch with their career very, very early on, in very, very young, at a very, very young age. And yes, you definitely are contributing to sustainable development by doing what you do. So now over to you, Mr. Tunde Agoro. Can you please share with our audience who might be listening for the first time? And can you please tell us how you got into your career as a professional in the climate and energy sector?
Okay, great. Thanks, Chisom, and African Catalyst. It's great to be here. I always love an opportunity to discuss anything sustainability, ESG, mostly within the African context as well. So yeah, for those that do not know me, I'm sure there'll be loads of them that don't. My name is Tunde Agoro, and I am a fractional chief sustainability officer and director with BGBL Consultant. And then I'm also the global sustainability lead for sustainability and ESG at Cosmos. That's my current role. Cosmos is a global digital cost and carbon consultancy, and I look after our sustainability and ESG team and the service offering that we deliver. How I go into the world of sustainability and ESG is very interesting, not too dissimilar to yeah, our other guests. But for me, my background was in architecture and construction project management. I got very passionate around the subject of sustainability, for which I got a Shipman scholarship to come to the UK to do a master's in environmental engineering at Imperial College. And one of our lecturers, who was the chief advisor to the Prime Minister, Professor David Fisk, he taught us the module on sustainable development. And as soon as I had that course, I knew that was it. This is where I want to be, in terms of how organizations need to think in the 21st century, in terms of how we can maintain the best outcomes for people and for planet, whether in terms of project delivery or whether in terms of how corporate manages and delivers stakeholder expectation, and of course business goals in its entirety. So so it was on my master's program. I discovered sustainability and ESG as a core passion, and I've since been working over the last 20 odd years, delivering from small projects to medium-sized projects to some of the largest regenerational projects in London, and working across various parts of the world, from the Middle East to Europe to America, and a few projects in Africa as well. So there you go, in a very in a nutshell.
Okay, and thank you very much for that introduction and how you got into your career as a professional in the climate and ESG sector. Right, so to kick off the conversation, I'd like to start with you, Mr. Abbass. Right, so when you're on the ground, what are some of the most underestimated project implementation and construction challenges in delivering infrastructure projects in sub-Saharan Africa?
Right. So from experience, there are a number of, such factors, but I would speak on two. The first one being aspects relating to community, land acquisition and stakeholder engagement. There is a sort of attachment that we have to land in Africa. I mean, maybe all over the world. We tend to see that oftentimes when project proponents or sponsors do not undertake stakeholder engagement very early on, they run into deep troubles much later. Because for big projects, for example, you would need a large swath of land, and that would mean if you're going into rural environment, you will be displacing people from their means of livelihoods. If you're going to take farmland, in some instances, because of the size of the land that you have, and the consideration of specific location with respect to the kind of project that you want to do, you see that you would need to even take lands that are owned by communities or by individuals. And these would naturally trigger, one of these performance standards of the IFC, land acquisition and involuntary resettlement. A similar standard you can see with the World Bank environmental and social standards or the African Development operational safeguards. What this means is that you cannot just displace people. So there can be physical displacement, there can be economic displacement. And this is often the case when you're doing linear project or big project like airport, or you're building a railway, right? Or you're building a dam. So such big project often involves land acquisition. And therefore, you see that in some instances where project sponsors do not apply these international standards that I mentioned earlier, they just do the process of land take and compensation based on national regulatory requirements, which often do not meet international requirements. Because for the most part, people may even be involuntarily resettled. Land will be expropriated from people without adequate compensation. And from experience, we've seen during RAP implementation audit, you see a situation where some people will lay claim to the land, whereas they have no title to the land. And this presents a lot of issues. So there could be a lot of legal tussle, right? In some instances, where communities don't even want the project to kickstart anything in terms of construction, they make sure they frustrate, the construction workers, and everything will not really work very well because there could be security issues. They could kidnap workers. And, when these happen, it obviously disrupts the operations of the project. And so we've seen situations where sometimes it can even be prohibitive for certain projects. So I've been involved in a project where the cost of compensation for land expropriation only is over ₦1 billion. So you can see. So which is why when we talk about issues like these, very early on at the project design, you apply what we call a mitigation hierarchy, where you're thinking about the first thing is, can we avoid this resettlement? Because it can be costly and it can have a lot of aftermath effect on the project proponent, the community people, because you would need to cater to project affected persons. In some instances, at a household level, project affected communities, you have to pay specific attention to how you manage the rights and privileges of vulnerable people, widows, widowers, people living with disability, women, female-headed household. So you need a lot of expertise to undertake this properly. And therefore, if you don't do it right, you will continue to experience challenges as you're developing your project because people will have grievances. They could take you to court, you could get a court order to stop work, and this will definitely affect how project is implemented. So I'll stop at that because of time. Now, let me go to the second point, which relates to the climate, biodiversity, and the broader environment. Now, I once visited a project on a mission. The whole idea of the project, or one of the sub-components, is to develop an irrigation system, for smallholder farmers in this region. However, it was clear that there wasn't appropriate integration of climate lens in the design of the project. And so when they had started the construction of the irrigation infrastructure, there was a heavy rain that came along and it washed away whatever it was that they had built. The rain almost even turned the whole environment around, such that some places that didn't have water now are waterlogged. And so the whole drive of trying to build irrigation infrastructure was completely disrupted. And that's a situation where climate consideration was not taken into consideration. And why is this the case? It was also based on the fact that this particular project did not conduct an environmental and social impact assessment, which is something that should have been done as part of the pre-feasibility or feasibility exercise that should then inform the final project design. And this leads back to the first point of stakeholder alignment, community issues, because when you do your ESIA right, if you do it right, you would have engaged with community people, you engage with diverse stakeholders, regulators, right, including NGOs, because stakeholders are either affected people or interested people. So you understand the level of their influences and their interests. And so when you build all of these into the design of the project, a project then, there's a concept of resilience of the project and resilience through the project. So resilience through the project is what that project translates to in terms of positive outcomes to community and the broader stakeholders. And by engaging rightly, you obtain what we call the social license to operate. And then you could even benefit from a lot of indigenous knowledge from the host communities that will support the development of the project. And to speak about climate change, because of our challenges with road network, you would see that in some instances, I was on a gas project recently, and we went on site. It was a harrowing experience getting to that rural site. It's that project, the project sponsor, that is now building the road, access road to the. In fact, at some point, we had to alight from the vehicle and walk the rest of the way to access the project site. Now imagine heavy equipment, machinery that needs to be transported to the project site. Do you know how long it's going to take for them to first build the road before they can start bringing heavy equipment to the site? And so, it's a challenge on the ground because there is no way a project can get done without these important infrastructure. And at the end of the day, if we don't consider climatic factors in the design of the road, and mind you, that particular project is going to involve a virtual pipeline where there will be several trucks moving in and out from that facility to distribute gas, LNG, LPG to different parts of the country. Mm-hmm. So it means there's going to be a serious, density on that road. Now, the design of that road, if it does not take into consideration topographic considerations, the climatic condition, it will not last. And that is part of how you build resilience of the project. So resilience through the project is how people are able to, protect themselves from the shocks and stresses of climate change, for example. And of course, by enjoying the outcome, because sometimes we are a lot output focused when it comes to the design and delivery of infrastructure. The physical piece of infrastructure is often the concern, whereas it's actually the use, the changes that come in terms of improvement in the lives of people that should actually drive delivery of infrastructure. And that's how people can achieve resilience through the project. They overcome their vulnerabilities, whether it's economic, social, right, or ecological. However, when this is missed out, and this is where we begin to experience challenges. So both in terms of climate, the broader environment, as well as, the social dynamics, these are real issues, because there are instances where community people will insist that they want to participate in the supply chain for a project. And so you need to, and because of where we find ourselves, a lot of expectations from communities. Sometimes we'll go to project site and project proponent will tell us as consultant that where do we draw the line between community expectations and our obligation? It's quite challenging. Some will demand that scholarships have to be paid. Some will demand a whole lot that their whole local youth should be employed on the project, even when they don't have the right skill set. Right. But we've seen how projects have, managed these issues. And only then do these projects have that sense of security? Because that's another issue. If you have a problem with your host communities, it presents real security issues, right? If you're going to have supply coming to the site, but the place is unsafe because of community agitation, they could block the road, and therefore your supplies will not get to the facility and delay construction, right? So all these are real issues that, if there is no consideration of the floodplain, if you're no consideration of meteorological data, heavy rainfall can disrupt operations significantly and affect project delivery. So these are some of the underground, issues that project sponsors need to pay attention to as they develop their project, so that we can achieve the dual objectives of resilience of the project, so that the project can withstand, shocks and stresses of disaster, of climate change impact, extreme weather events, and of course, the resilience through the project, which speaks to the outcome that people can realize as a result of the development of that project.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very, very detailed, and I actually find how you explore that very, very fascinating. You drew from your wealth of experiences on interacting with project and share some of the challenges encountered. I find it very, very funny that to build a project, you have to build it first, right? Then carry the equipment,
of course,
and then go and build the project that actually wants to build for the community.
And that tells you the significant gap in infrastructure that exists.
Yes. Yeah, and one thing I really like is so a lot of the things you mentioned are things we're actually going to get to regarding the impact of rainfall, and then people who the workers gap, right, the experience gap, the skill gap, right. But I think one thing I picked up from what you said was people's unwillingness to comply with the international standards, and then they're focused on the local standards. And I would like to ask you if you could communicate a bit briefly, what do those projects who fail to take into consideration the international standards, what do they get to face? What are the challenges that might come their way as a result of not wanting to comply?
I think I've been on both sides.
Yeah.
Right, where on the one hand, you're telling people follow these standards. On the other hand, you are responsible for ensuring that project developers also align with the standard. Now, when you don't follow these standards, and this is where we must understand what we call systems thinking in sustainability. One of the 4 laws of ecology by Barry Commoner is that, everything is connected to everything. So it means that impact in one place can affect other places. And so some of the things that you don't find sufficient analysis for, maybe you're looking at our ESIA, the typical ESIA that is conducted that is not aligned with the international standard, you don't see the proper analysis of alternatives. There are different range of categories of alternatives, whether it's in terms of sourcing materials, location, schedule of work, routine, you just find maybe 1 or 2 paragraphs, no proper analysis, quantitative and qualitative analysis that ensures that all the diverse options have been assessed and evaluated rigorously before a particular, design or, work method or schedule is picked from the options available. What that does at the end of the day is that it affects certain level of efficiency down the line when the project, maybe even at the construction phase or later at the operations phase. Then you also have, sometimes it's not that these people don't want to, but it often feels burdensome because they have to go extra mile. For example, if you're doing resettlement of people, now if you're going to use IFC PS5, which is on land acquisition and involuntary resettlement,
the same, ESS5 for World Bank, OS5 for African Development Bank. If you're going to apply this, the amount of compensation you're going to pay is a lot more. Because if you're going to apply the Nigerian law, you're just, paying for replacement value of the asset that is affected. However, if you're going to move someone under these standards, you would need to pay transitional cost, beyond just the replacement value. In fact, what they do locally is a lot around the market value, not replacement value. Replacement value, has a bit more layer in terms of additional consideration to ensure that you leave the affected person better than you found them, right? And so it costs more. But at the end of the day, it may cost more in the immediate term, but it helps to reduce vulnerability of people in the long term. And because everything is connected to everything else, if you don't fix this issue, it is these people who are vulnerable that later become security menace to the community, to the society. I visited a hydropower station 2 or 3 years ago, and we couldn't access the site unless an armored tank was with us. Because of insecurity, you could be kidnapped. That's a high-value asset. Why is that the case? It's because of certain neglect of the rights of people that are affected by some of this project. Because many people will tell you the development of that dam has led to loss of their livelihoods. Many people may have to change livelihoods. In a country where you are barely surviving and you have grown attached to certain skill set based on the work your forefathers have been doing, and then a project comes, it disrupts this livelihood, and you now need to pivot to another livelihood, which means you're going to have to learn new skills. Not everyone can actually survive that. So it presents a big challenge, for these community people. And this is why you now see these same people. Look at what has happened with the oil and gas sector. Why do we have a lot of kidnappings, that we later have to do amnesty? Right?
Yes.
So these are some of the aftermath. You can cause irreparable damage to the environment, which is why you have a lot of remediation activities going on now. But can we truly restore the environment to its original state? Right? Then you can also see how it would disrupt, social harmony. And this is why it may be challenging to implement these standards, but it's the best course, because if you think for the long term, then you will see that, because there's what we call intergenerational equity. You're not just doing it for this generation. And when you look at the definition of sustainable development, is what you are doing not for this generation, but for future generation to also be able to benefit from what we have. And so we've seen that even the Federal Ministry of Environment, based on interactions with all of DFIs, they've now included as part of guidelines for conducting ESIA, that project should now, apply IFC performance standards, EFDB operational safeguards as part of key, framework that are used to prepare ESIA instrument or even RAP instrument. So it's in the benefit. It pays the project to apply this stringent requirement upfront because it saves cost downstream.
Okay, and I found it very, very interesting, like the importance of systems thinking in, like establishing a project, right? I was going to ask if the $1 billion was that like as a result of like them trying to comply with the IFC standard? Was that as a result of that? Because I sort of found it's like interesting that like national standards will require you to do that.
Well, I mean, if you look at the Land Use Act of Nigeria, right, it has provisions for compensating people if you're going to resettle them. However, these additional elements of transition support, paying specific attention to vulnerable people, these are not properly covered, right? Then under the law, if you don't have tenure right, you may not be compensated. So, but with this the IFC standards and all these other standards, it caters to even squatters, right? People who don't have title to the land, but they heck their livelihood through that land. You still need to provide them with some sort of livelihood support, skill acquisition, because there's a social cost to not treating people right.
Yes.
And project, if not immediately, will directly or indirectly suffer from it.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Abbass Agbaje. So now I'd like to turn the conversation like a little bit to supply chains gap, and this is to you, Mr. Tunde Agoro. Right. So how do local supply chain gaps and import dependency affect project timelines and cost overrun? Right. So the thing is, we hear about cement shortages, and then we hear about rebar like availability as well as specialist equipment, but we never really know what like a 6-week delay does on like the critical materials for like project costs and timelines in real time. So can you please like walk us through this? Thank you very much, Mr. Tunde. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Chisholm. I think Mr. Abbass has done great justice to that first question right there. I think to start with, I think it's important to state very emphatically that infrastructure, in terms of infrastructure deficit, actually in sub-Saharan Africa is very deep, right? It's very well documented, but we also know that it's very, very solvable, right? And in terms of all the major things that challenge us, I think Mr. Abbas touched on one of the key bits of it, which is the human side of life. And this is what your question is really about as well. It's about the human capital, right? And Mr. Abbas has talked about the other side of human capital, the community, the end users, getting that buy-in, the fact that people matter. All right. And the problem really is that, do they really matter when we deliver projects in sub-Saharan Africa? Your guess is as good as mine. And one of the main points Mr. Abbas made there is, you need to let the people's voice be heard, right? And there's a social cost to not doing that, right? Now, the other side of human capital is now on the delivery side of life, i.e., the supply chain, and that's what Chisholm is how local supply chain. All right. So uncertainty is one of the major problems we've got with supply chain gaps and our dependency on import. And the unintended consequence of this is a compounding effect. All right. Because any little delay, from the supply chain, it becomes a schedule multiplier. All right. One little delay here creates a ripple effect, a dominoes effect, if you like, that runs through the entire project. So when we talk about large infrastructure projects, right, more often than not, we rely a lot on expatriates. We rely a lot on international development firms, so to speak. But there is a missing wedge in there between, if you like, the strategies, the experts, the local laborers. It is that middle translator there, right, of expertise, local expertise, all right, in the supply chain. That is a major, major problem. On the other side of supply chain, talking about imports, well, we can overtalk this if we want, but we don't need to. It's our dependency, on imports and the variability of exchange rates and how that can totally knock the budget of a project out of the waters and totally makes it unviable, i.e., it cannot complete. And the statistics is out there. to show for it in terms of the vast majority of infrastructure projects that still stay uncompleted. They are stagnant projects. The statistics is staggering. We're talking about over 65% of projects being stagnated because of these issues. So currency volatility is a major problem in terms of the economic sustainability and viability of projects in sub-Saharan Africa, from the supply chain side of life, and then also that skills gap we're talking about in terms of the whole delivery team and workforce. So bridging labor on ground with the whole strategic direction coming in from the top.
Okay. So something you mentioned was currency volatility. So first of all, over 65% of like projects being stagnant is like a very crazy, and it's just very insane. I think I came across something recently about how 95% of projects in Nigeria don't just reach financial close. Right, and that's a problem. That is a very big problem. And then you mentioned something about currency volatility, and I wanted to ask. When you're importing equipment and materials and like the naira shifts on you mid-project, how do like contractors absorb that, right? Or do they actually absorb that?
Well, so it's a good point. So what you're talking about there is an important element of project planning. All right. And it's also all part of the initial project execution and implementation strategy. It's risk mitigation and contingency planning. All right. So the problem with that is it's often underestimated. All right. And the truth is, if you were to estimate that as correctly or as accurately as you could possibly do, it just knocks the project cost out of the waters. All right. It raises the total project cost significantly. So in many cases, we find all those risk mitigation elements and contingencies are often minimized. They are underreported. And because it's an eventuality that is often more difficult to substantiate, because again, remember the word I mentioned about the golden thread of uncertainty running through the supply chain. All right. It's often swept under the carpet. And when we get to just before execution, there's this key piece of work we tend to do after design, which we call value engineering. Actually, for cost cutting. All right. And one of the first elements that goes off is contingency. All right. So should that be 5%? Should it be 10%? Should it be 20%? Should it be 35%? Should it be more? Now, looking at all of the various complexities of delivering projects in sub-Saharan Africa with loads of things to consider, like environmental factors, which Mr. Abbass mentioned, right? Societal factors, cultural factors, political factors, and all these other things. Perhaps that particular element needs to be further and well reinforced, but we often don't. So we account for it almost as a lip service, almost as a tick box in terms of the whole project management protocol. But before the rubber meets the road, value engineering, aka cost cutting, often tends to debilitate or erase a lot of that contingency. And then it means we get to a point where the actual costs cannot actually deliver the project. Hence, we get stagnated projects because there is no funds, there is no money. It's not been accounted for or properly accounted for at the right stages.
Okay, thank you very much for that response. Right, so like as a follow-up to this, and to ask our next question, so we have like the fragile supply chain on one hand, and then on the other hand, we have like currency, like volatility, and on top of all of that, the rain comes, and I actually do mean that's quite literally the theme of this episode is building in the rain. right? Because I genuinely think that climate and terrain are probably the most systematically undervalued and systematically and underestimated variable in Africa project delivery. So I'd like to talk to me about that, right? How does the project delivery how honest, are project delivery schedules about the impact of climate change, right? And in your experience, project design for the Africa they are building in, or are they building for like an idealized version of Africa?
Yeah, that's a good point. You raised there, Chisholm. Very good question, and I think what you described, I like to call it the African risk premium. um, and again, more often than not, they are often discounted at project level. All right. And that's all about context. For a lot of time, we talk about content, but context, I think is king. All right. Designing for an African context, an African landscape, looking at environmental factors, climate change risks, is so important. I mean, Mr. Abbass talks about probabilistic weather scenarios and current meteorological data and stuff like that. How many projects actually look into those sort of things here in sub-Saharan Africa? So in my experience dealing with projects here in England, in the UK, and in Europe, it's an empirical, an imperative, for you to make an allowance for climate change right from concept stage. All right, we talk about making an allowance um, for probabilistic extreme weather events. So whether it's going to be flood, whether it's rising temperature, um, whatever it could be, those factors are woven into the design right from day one. All right. So we have something called the climate change allowance. So if you're designing a massive structure, whether a bridge, whether a port, whether it's a massive road network or a massive building project, or even huge complexes, you always have to have a minimum 20% allowance for climate change. All right, and it's all relies on a lot of studies, right? Looking at meteorological data, looking at what the likely, extreme weather frequency could be like, what the extreme weather events could be like, looking at the frequencies, looking at the impacts, looking at, and then what mitigating measures could we put in place. Now, this requires leaning on specialists, leaning on consultants to deliver all this niche package of work. But again, when we come to project delivery, you always have this value engineering or so-called cost-cutting exercise where these specialisms are often neglected. So things like the impact on ecosystem biodiversity, planning the project to be outside certain breeding windows, and calendars, those things have an impact on how you schedule a project. Now, you wouldn't know that if you don't have the relevant expertise on board. Now, when you do that, and then that could have a knock-on effect, in terms of, what happens within the community. That could lead to civil unrest, societal protest, and there's a social and environmental cost associated with it. So again, just that bit, that contingency planning for what I call the African risk premium, is one of the things which we need to ring fans when it comes to sub-Saharan infrastructure projects. No cost cutting, no corner cutting. No, we need to do these things to the T, right, and not just skip over them, because eventually they come down to halt the project outcomes.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is it's not a situation of like the projects that are designed, like at the project delivery schedules being designed for the Africa they are building in. It's not like that. It's more of a situation like it is non-existent, right? And they are basically just avoiding it. Right. So, as a follow-up to that, I would like to ask Mr. Abbass, like, so regarding the climate conditions, how can project owners be more prepared? And what would it actually look like to price in and schedule correctly for Nigerian and West African conditions? You know, what changes when like the climate is taken into consideration?
Right. Thank you, Jason. I think very great perspectives shared by Mr. Agoro in terms of, climate impact and how many projects don't make that climate allowance. And we can see the difference between, how projects are conceptualized, designed, and delivered, in advanced economies compared to, our own emerging or developing economies. And perhaps maybe people can argue that those guys have enough, so they're thinking of the extras. And so we just have to get something that we can manage in the interim. But again, I think it's just as they say that it's penny wise, pound foolish. If you think that you want to save money in the moment, only to lose a whole lot more, in the long term. And so that same climate allowance, the climate premium, has to be factored in how we design and deliver projects. Some research by the World Bank, the World Economic Forum have shown that, if you don't pay attention to issues around flooding or rainfall, it could lead to, accelerated aging of infrastructure, right? And what it means is that, we always say something in Nigeria, we don't have maintenance culture, right?
Yeah.
That's our crude way of saying it.
True.
It means that with climate change impact, there's going to be a lot of rehabilitation that will have to happen. And that rehabilitation cost, have you ever done house renovation and building a house from the scratch? You would see that it's a lot more stressful to renovate, to rehabilitate than building from the scratch.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so project sponsors, proponents must think about these very early on and see that it pays right from the conceptual stage. In fact, in many financial institutions, they do climate risk screening before they approve a project. Because very early on, they want to understand what the climate-related issues are and ensure that, they can protect the project against this. Because, in the event of any serious climate shock or stress, the whole calculation of your NPVs, ROIs is going to be, in the thin air. So in 2022, there was a flooding event in Nigeria. And communities which were hitherto unserved, underserved, got mini-grid projects, installed in their communities, and now they have electricity. But guess what happened? When that rain, the downpour came, it actually submerged the mini-grid site. A live mini-grid site submerged under the rain. Now, don't forget that typically, because of their small size, mini-grids don't often, get access to financing directly.
Yes.
These are typically by subsidies or grants by DFIs, right? And they pay based on, it's more like a model of result-based financing, right?
Yes.
Based on the number of connections that have been agreed, and then they pay them for it. But now what happened when that project is submerged, right?
Yes.
And so this is the thinking from the outset. Think about what could happen in the future.
it's not just even rainfall or flooding. It could also be heat and drought, right? Nigeria is one place, and we have other countries that are dependent on, hydropower stations for supply of energy.
Mm-hmm.
When you don't pay attention to the hydrogeological regime or the hydrological regime, then, and remember that the turbines of, these power stations is turned by what? The volume of water that releases a lot of pressure, right? Now, when the level of water reduces and there is no adequate, force to turn the turbine, it reduces the capacity of that hydropower station to supply electricity. And now I have a case in point where one of such entities have started to think about the future, to now integrate solar renewables, in their system, so that if there is any shortfall in terms of water availability, then the solar renewables, solar PVs renewables will, plug the gap. So that's thinking ahead. This is part of adaptation thinking,
Yes.
right? And because heat, for example, those that do material designs, they understand that every material is designed to a specific standard. So exposure to higher heat level over an extended period of time, of course, from our basic physics, we know that the particles that are congealed, that are in the state of rest, will be excited. It forms breakdown of these materials, and therefore these parts wear out quickly. Look at the Third Mainland Bridge. Do you know how long it has been built? And very recently it's been rehabilitated. The weather for which it was built then is not the same weather that we have now.
Yes.
It's increasingly getting hot. There are always expansion joints that are also, built into these bridges, because they understand that when heat comes to these metals, they also expand. So these are key considerations. If you don't build these things in well enough, it becomes a challenge. You build a power plant,
Recording in
a thermal power
progress.
plant, it needs cooling. It needs adequate water. If there is drought, if there is water scarcity, how do you continue to ensure cooling? If you're designing a brewery without thinking about, the water in the environment, perhaps maybe if you have a lot of money and it's costly for you to desalinate water from the ocean, that from abstracting water from natural underground aquifer. So these are real things that, businesses must think, project must think through as they want to deliver on, positive outcomes. And where we can begin to have the changes is from the early on, just like Mr. Agoro said, your ESIA, in fact, the Federal Ministry of Environment, unlike before, now mandate that your ESIA should have, by the time you are completing your ESIA and you are developing your environmental and social management plan, you should also develop a climate change management plan.
Interesting.
Yeah, because there's that awareness. We can see there's a lot of projects that have gone really bad as a result of lack of consideration of climate risk. And if you build all the best irrigation infrastructure, but there is no water, of what use? So more than anything, Mr. Agoro also touched on the point of, skills deficiency, which is a critical one. Like I said, how many experts do we have on the ground that can do climate modeling, right?
Yeah.
Do we have, now, unlike before, we now have improved level of data set, right, for, monitoring different climate data. But do we have the requisite capacity in terms of people who will, transform these data sets into decision useful insight at the project level? So these are critical capacity constraints. And therefore, as we design our project, as we make that climate allowance, it would not just be in terms of the key criteria in terms of potential climate, issues such as temperature, humidity, moisture. We also think about the human capital component to think that projects should also include considerations of building local capacity, right? And we've seen examples that, we find international, staff come, expatriate come, but after some time they leave. But with this Japa syndrome as well, you cannot be getting a 500K job in Nigeria and get a 50K pounds job in the UK. I'm sure Mr. Agoro will agree that you would rather go to the UK than stay with 500K in Nigeria.
Yeah, that's very
If you have that skills. Especially when sometimes the tone from the top does not allow you also even use your expertise. They tell you, what do you know? Our forefathers have been around. Please keep all your science to one side. And therefore, some people would prefer to be in climes where their intellectual contribution will be much appreciated because those guys understand the things. I mean, look at the issues of wildfire in California. What happened? Look at people abandoned their homes.
Yes.
These are real things. So when we do due diligence for, our infrastructure clients, we embed this climate lens. There are tools that have been developed by the World Bank and some other institutions. For example, if you use ThinkHazard, there's Global Forest Watch, Wildfire Watch, right? So you use some of these tools to understand some of the vulnerabilities of the project. You understand because it's at different spatial level. So there's the Nigeria level, there's the state level, there is the local where the project is being designed. The susceptibility to different climate stress and shocks may be different. It could be high at the country level, medium at the state level, but could be low or negligible at the local level, depending on the location of the project. And so the design of any measure to ensure resilience of a project needs to take into consideration these special skills. And therefore, as we draft RFPs for our contractors, we must reflect as part of our procurement requirement considerations of these climate issues. Like Mr. Agoro said, that climate allowance, most times we don't make allowance for it, but it then happens. It leads to cost overruns, delays. But if you have built it in, if you, rather than do value engineering, right, you do climate-informed value engineering, where you have embedded climate lens in your value engineering, because you are not talking of the value in the short term, you're talking about the value of the long term. And, the difference is in thinking about output and outcome. If you're outcome oriented, you think long term. If you're output oriented, you think short term. And there is a difference for those who apply these principles systematically and consistency, and those just do it just for compliance purposes.
Okay, so I noticed Mr. Tunde nodding his head while Mr. Abbass Agbaje, and I had the feeling that you wanted to share something more. So please, over to you, sir.
Oh no, I mean not necessarily. I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Mr. Abbass was saying there. And I love the emphasis he's making, around outcomes focus, beyond just the output. All right. When you look at the outcomes, there's a whole lot more that you are able to include within the project, and we've been for far too long been penny wise and pound foolish in Africa, and even bringing it to home in Nigeria. We've missed too many opportunities. We've allowed inequality to thrive. We've limited our resilience. We've constrained our growth simply because of short-termism. Right, we look at the short-term gains and we miss, the overarching long-term outcomes, which are, if I use the word Mr. Abbass used earlier on, which are intergenerational. So it's a massive opportunity that we've missed. We've continued to miss, and I would love to see that change in current and future projects.
Okay, so let's stay on you for like a while longer. I would like to ask, if you could change 3 things about how infrastructure contracts are designed for climate adaptation and mitigation, or what would your advice be? What would you change?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, you missed that in there.
Right. I think it starts with data. It always starts with data. What do you know? It starts with what you know. It has to be data-led. All right. If you're looking at real outcomes and ambitions on projects, it's got to be substantiated. We need to make it tangible. We need to make it real. All right. It's not just about putting a finger in the air and saying, okay, all right, this would be nice. This would be good. No, we need to lead with science. We need to be empirical. We need to use metrics in terms of informing decisions and outcomes on our project, which is why it is essential to do the necessary work from first principles. All right. So if we mandate, that initial study, climate study, that environmental impact assessment, being done. These are mandatory things you got to do right here in this side of the hemisphere, as part of the pre-planning stage. You got to do it. It's mandatory, right? There is no negotiation about it, right? So it's something that has to become mandatory, not voluntary. Okay, and it's got to be comprehensive as well. All right. If we carry out all of these empirical studies that are not generic, that are site and project specific, in order to gain valuable insights on what the project direction needs to take, that's key, right? And that requires, number one, having the right regulatory mechanisms in place, having the right experts round the table, and then of course ensuring that the insights from all these studies are carried into the design, right? And they're not chalked out at value engineering stage, but carried on into all of the contractual documentations and what the project requirements need to be, and hopefully that would change the eventual outcomes to something more positive.
Okay, thank you very much. So how about you? What would your suggestions be, Mr. Abbaje?
Well, thank you so much. I think if I would piggyback on what Mr. Agoro spoke to earlier regarding supply chain, I would think that given the critical role of supply chain and project delivery, it's important to pay attention to thinking through how climate change could impact the supply chain. Because if you are expecting deliveries of certain equipment from, Europe, and there is terrible weather condition, then it's going to delay the time of arrival of the shipment. So, and that's at the international level. But what about locally? Because again, increasingly, we've seen that African countries, and of course, including Nigeria, are thinking a lot more about, optimizing local content in the delivery of infrastructure. However, because of the peculiarities of our infrastructure challenges, climate-related issues, could impact on supply chain integrity.
And so part of what, should go into, contractual agreements would be that, EPC contractors should conduct supplier audits, to understand what kind of climate risk they may be vulnerable to, and therefore design mitigants, because again, if you don't understand these issues, how can you then prepare to address the concerns that could emerge later, right? And this is so you take, for example, a project where, a lot of trucks will be needed to move product to, various destinations. Now, if the local supplier you depend on also is dependent on an international supplier, right?
Mhm.
Any delay from that end will affect his own delivery timeline and, of course, impact on the project. So you have parts to be replaced on trucks, for example. Maybe, the truck, fell into a collapsed bridge, and, it affected the functioning of some of the fleet and so many other things. You can't find replacement parts. And, in some instances, when we talk about climate change, we're not talking about just physical risks only. There are also transition risks, right? And with this transition risk, you can have issues such as technological obsolescence, right? So if a particular local supplier that you're dependent on uses a technology that is being gradually phased out by Western economies or advanced economies, it means that if that piece of machinery or equipment, has any fault, it may be difficult for him to source replacement parts, and that could delay the production of your own material input, right?
Yeah.
So these are real issues. If you're using a quarry, right, and you need explosives and the likes, and it's raining heavily, or even, when you go to a quarry, you see, dishes because, of a lot of excavations and the like, and there's a lot of heavy downpour. It's going to impact on how the work at the quarry will progress, because the topography will, the old soil will be soggy, right? You can't use explosive in a wet environment.
Yeah.
So these are key considerations to think around, as you look at. So, whether in your bill of quantities, in your RFPs, in your contractual engagement, there should be specific climate-related clauses that ensures that, some of the potential cost variances that could happen as a result of climate adaptation-related issues, should be embedded in the contract, because if this is not done upfront, it could lead to a lot of disputes later on, and of course, with dispute comes delay and project cost overall.
Okay, I thank you very much for that, Mr. Agbaje. So most of what is being said is about specificity, right? Rather than generic, data, like specificity of your data and the climate-related clauses for like the projects that you are developing, right? And now I'd like to talk to something that we've sort of danced around a little bit in this conversation, and that is skill gap. Right, Nigeria has one of the largest construction workforce on the continent, but the gap seems to be at the supervisory and technical level, right? The people who translate a design into a decision on the ground, how do they, how do you close that gap without it costing you the project you are trying to deliver on? I'd like to, pass that question to Mr. Tunde Agoro. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Chisom. Chisom, you are about to touch a nerve. I'm very, very passionate about this particular subject and this area, because we have a significant reliance on international experts, and it's great. We need them, and this is one of the things I looked at during my master's study when I was talking about adaptation versus adoption of sustainable practices and technologies. All right. We are too quick to adopt, rather than adapting to our local context. And the same principle applies to how we deal with, local supply chain in terms of how are we building our own local capacity, right? We've missed a trick. We've missed a trick for far too long. I've heard of so many Chinese companies that take on national projects in sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria, and further afield in the continent. And basically, every key part of the workforce is imported from China. It's ridiculous. So not only are they delivering the project, there is no knowledge transfer. A total missed opportunity. Look, every project has got to be seen beyond just an output, as we've established already, in the beginning of this podcast. We've got to look at the outcomes. The outcomes is beyond just the physical project. It's the millions of lives that are going to change. It's the growth in terms of capacity building. It's how we boost the local economy, right? Those are the key outcomes. And in terms of building effective local capacity, this is one of the major opportunities we get by bringing international contractors, international experts into our project. And therefore, capacity building or capacity development has got to be a core delivery outcome. It's got to be one of the key contractual clauses, right? And I'm not talking about just using, if you like, just the laborers, the lower part of the supply chain, but feeling every key part, of project delivery with local workforce, right? And again, the idea of starting this when the construction starts it's a fallacy. It's ridiculous, because then it's too late. All right. Capacity building needs to start at least 12, 24 months into project execution. Targets need to be set, for the international contractors and firms that are coming to deliver this major infrastructure for us. Different training workshops, pre-apprenticeships, and a whole vast, majority, of key project delivery skills needs to be taught out, need to be integrated. So basically, we need a joint execution model. All right, not just symbolic partnership where the international contractors can just get away with putting a few laborers, low wage, low paid, laborers on the scheme. Whereas sort of the key areas, of the delivery work are filled with their own people. So again, it's one of the reasons why we are where we are today. Who says other countries shouldn't be importing contracting firms from Nigeria? Why not? I was in Lagos a few months ago, and I saw an interesting development taking place on Ozumba and Badiwe. And I looked at the board, just in front of this massive multi-story building, and all the contractors there were from South Africa. I was like, wow, we are importing experts from South Africa. Who is importing Nigerian contractors? Right. We do have expertise, but we need to recognize them. We need to trust our own expertise, our own products, our own people, our own capabilities. And we need to give them room to grow, give them the right space and place to thrive on projects. I don't want to keep waffling on, but I think I might have made some key points on there. Mr. Abbass, I want to
Yes,
add to this
yes,
as
you
well.
have. Yes, you actually have made very, very important points, right? And I actually don't understand if this strikes a nerve. It's actually very, very appalling to, look at the list of contractors on the project and then all of them are foreigners. Do you understand? And, in our agreements in developing these projects, there is no joint development. Look how individuals are not being empowered. And I think in a way that also affects sustainability, like Mr. Abbas made reference to, right? So the contractors come and then they go, and then what happens when when these projects needs to be repaired or like adjustments needs to be made, right? So we are running out of time, and I'd like to ask Mr. Abbas if you would change one thing about infrastructure contract. Okay, sorry. So my question to you is, if a young project engineer is listening to this right now, what's one thing you would want them to carry from this conversation?
Okay. I would have thought that Mr. Agoro, who is an architect
Oh,
and
he'll go,
engineering,
he'll
would be
come after,
better
yeah.
suited for that question, but it's fine.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as though you've been reading my mind, and I've been thinking about all of our civil engineers, electrical engineers and the likes. And what immediately comes to mind is our education system output oriented or outcome oriented? Because I ask that question in all honesty, as we think about the numbers of graduates that we turn out every year, do we track the number of patents that come from our universities? We have our people always eager to use, I'm Dr. So, I have a PhD in so, respectfully, that's inspiring. But what I've also learned is that there are other countries with vast number of PhDs, but that PhD has attached to it a lot of patents. So there has to be more from, our Ministry of Education. All of these construction companies, is there a memorandum of understanding between them and various universities to make sure that students have reserved spots annually for internships on construction projects? Now, how many of our engineering lecturers have actually had field experience implementing a lot of the theories that they know? Do we need to start considering the so-called people that should retire to come back to the academic system, to teach the young ones from real experience on the field? I know, schools may differ in how they implement these approaches, but I think that fundamentally, we need to go back. Maybe nothing is so much wrong in our curriculum, but when it is all about getting 5.0, right, getting all A's, without positioning ourselves to really solve problems. I think our education is not typically problem-oriented. How many computer graduates? We have so many computer graduates today. Can we start to think like the likes of Elon Musk, that we have our own satellite? What are they building? When they write on the graduate project, MSc project, what's it all about? We don't even we don't dedicate a lot of money to research and development. So how then do we want to build the future? If somewhere where a lot of our servers are dependent, the servers that serve us
in this country, they decide to turn off those servers in these countries, what is left of us?
That's very true.
So these are real questions. When we talk about infrastructure, there are 3 levels. There is the hard infrastructure, which is all of what we are talking about that climate will impact. There's a soft infrastructure, which is the patent. All these standardized designs were made by some people. So we must think beyond just always. I like the fact that Mr. Agoro mentioned something about adoption and adaptation. While it is counterintuitive to just adopt something from a climate that is significantly different from yours, of course with some semblance anyways, we can at least apply our ingenuity in adapting those things to suit our own environment and beyond just adapting. And I think that's where the problem is. We adapt and stay there. Microsoft, all of this, they keep releasing new versions, improving the growth mindset. Nothing is ever the best. So even if you have adopted or adapted something, can't you think about it in your own universities, in your institute, and advance it? Beyond just having very good theses, shiny gowns, we need to really, really work ourselves to take ourselves out of this dependency on these other nations. It has to be a place of interdependency. Who built the pyramid of Giza? This is in Africa. And so what are we doing to revitalize our education? And then there is the hardware. So there's the hardware, there's the software, there's the hardware, that's the institutional capacity, governance. A lot of universities are happy making money from selling pure water, having bakery. But why can't they make money from revolutionizing patents? It's a long-term thing, beyond just immediate money-making ventures and vying for political positions within the university system. There's more that can be delivered, because if we can't save ourselves from this citadel of learning, we will continue to depend on these expatriates. And then, what are we bequeathing to our children? So this is a fundamental question. Every year, people write JAM, they get into university, the announced number of graduates. The number of graduates don't really match the level of development that we must achieve. These other countries, they've thought about this. Why do we go to the UK to study? I studied in the UK, University of Greenwich, because I got Commonwealth scholarship. It changed the way I thought about things. It was the first real exposure to critical thinking. Before then, I would take any paper that is published and think, because this paper is published, it must make sense. But it took one class to demystify that. For my master's thesis, I read up to 150 papers. That's what real education does to you. Before you write a sentence, you critique it. So if we apply these sort of rigorous heuristics in our own educational environment, I think this skill gap that we talk about, we have brilliant people, and that's where the hardware comes, right? We have brilliant people. The people that have PhDs, they are brilliant. They're only limited because there is no sufficient funding to this exercise. And this is a country where we spend so much money on frivolities, on carnivals. Should we be doing a lot of carnivals when, poverty is a cannibal to our existence? So you can see, just as Mr. Agoro, I'm so passionate about this, which is why on my own hand at Impact Crest, I decided that we want to be the talent factory for ESG in Africa. So we launched our own internship program. The first set of people that I started with, I decided to target, people, women of 35 years age and above, who have had, family obligations that could have prevented them from continuing their career. And I can tell you proudly, they've transitioned to have very good career path today. Senior positions in leading institutions. Our most recent cohort of 20 people across 4 different African countries. We're giving them something. I gave them a structure, I gave them a system. That's the Ogwe. To begin to engineer the minds, because we can all complain all we want. What are you doing about it? And so, for me to have these rights to speak about this issue, I can tell you that I'm already doing something.
Yes.
And this is where we must be for us to bridge this gap. When I went to Lebanon in 2020, and the immigration officer asked, "Why are you in town?" And I told him that I'm a consultant. I'm here to consult for a company in Lebanon. He looked at me with a strange eye. This black guy, who is he consulting for? Because it's a different direction.
Yes.
And that's the feeling. That we have exportable minds, exportable brains. This brain drain is not just, metaphorical. We've got what it takes. And we need to blend the three: the hardware, the software, and the hardware. And that's the only way we'll break the skill gap.
Thank you very much. That was very powerful. That was very, very powerful. You spoke with so much passion. And yes, the brain drain does, pose like a very, very great problem, like to Nigeria, not just, with the skill gap, also economically, right? And I'd like to, transfer that question to Mr. Tunde Agoro, right? Can you please, share one thing that you want a young project engineer to carry from this conversation?
Yeah, thanks, Chisom. It's been a great time of dialogue and conversations. I love Mr. Abbass's passion there. I share in that passion, and kudos to you for your efforts at local capacity building and supporting, our local talent pool, especially the female gender, which is an important key to unlocking opportunities in African infrastructure as well, because it's a very male-dominated, if you like, sector, and it's great to be able to see the contribution of the female gender as well, which is fantastic. I could go on and on about that, but to the question, really. So well done again, Mr. Abbass, for the scholarship and internship program you've been doing on there, which is brilliant. So if I was going to say one thing to young or future project engineers, consultants looking to step into this part of the challenge Africa faces, I don't want to overlabel the educational part of life, but it's key to where we go, because that is where you are. You are at the point where you're still learning. All right. So to learn, curiosity is key. All right. And Mr. Abbass talked about his thesis, at is this with Greenwich University? I can't remember the university he mentioned. Greenwich University, and he mentioned that he read over 150 papers. So I would say to you, look, what you get out of university is a factor of what you put into it. All right. A lot of people always asked me, how was I so different in university? Why was I always a top graduating student? Why was I different? Why is it that in my year 2, I won year 2, year 3, back to back, I won regional design competitions in architecture school, where there were year 6, year 7 people from various universities. It's because I taught differently. So I would say in two phrases, to make yourself different, to make yourself stand out, to be able to really contribute to positive outcomes in the future and to be relevant. Number one, you need to learn globally, but you need to think locally. All right. Look beyond just your locality. All right. In terms of understanding, what is the art of what is possible, understanding the breadth of ever-changing, growing, technological, institutional, landscape, regulatory landscape all around the world in terms of your field of expertise. Learn from Asia, learn from Europe, learn from the Americas, learn from everywhere all around. But as you're learning these things, think locally. What does this mean for Africa? What does this mean for sub-Saharan Africa? What does this mean in a Nigerian context? What does this mean for a project in Ajigule? What does this mean for a project in Kaduna? How does this translate to something viable and feasible in Owerri? Think about the local context, apply it, and apply yourself to community projects. Get involved with small, companies, even big ones if possible. Throughout my course in university, beyond the mandatory industrial attachments, every break we had in university, I was working in a consulting contracting firm. From my year one till I finished, I would go there and volunteer, understudy the real experts. By the time I came back to school, my thinking was different. I brought out solutions that were embedded in practice. It made sense. It was not just textbook. And then I was exposed to international journals, all right, at that very early stage. So learn globally, consume as much as you can, be curious, but think and translate it locally. That's what I'll say to you. And I wish you all the best.
Okay. So something I'm taking from this is, the importance of, bridging the gap between what you're learning theoretically and, practical and practicing, right? Mr. Tunde Agoro shared with us how he would, volunteer during internships at consulting firms while I'm doing breaks in university. And Mr. Abbass shared something similar to us of that nature, and how he currently enables, women to do that. And I find that very, very admirable, right? So learn globally and think locally. Understand? So for this segment, it's going to be very, very short, and it's a segment called the rapid fire questions, right? So your answer is definitely going to be very short and concise, and just comprises of 2 questions. And to kick us off, I would like to start with Mr. Tunde Agoro before Mr. Abbass. And the first question is, what's the most dangerous climate impact in African infrastructure delivery that is most overlooked?
Water.
Okay, water. Okay, and then the second one is one country on the continent that's getting climate-focused projects delivery right.
I'll say South Africa.
That was exactly my thoughts. All right, now to Mr. Abbass Agbaje. The most dangerous climate impact in African infrastructure delivery that is most overlooked.
Well, it seems that I would share the same response by Mr. Agoro, but I think the other one would also be heat, right? Yes, heat. And that's temperature rise. So why that is the case, for example, you see, we're trying to solarize communities, and people are now having rooftop solars.
Yeah.
However, you see, when this is not installed properly, because of the heat, it has led to a lot of fire incidents, and so this is one key issue.
Okay, and then the second question is one country on the continent that's getting climate-focused projects delivery right.
Okay, I would say Kenya.
Kenya. Interesting. That's interesting. So we have water and here, South Africa and Kenya. All right, so we've come to the end of this episode of Making Infrastructure Happen. And it was a very insightful conversation, honestly. I did not want it to end. And I would like to thank both of our guests. This has genuinely been a candid conversation and one that actually matters. Right. So if you found this helpful, share it with someone who builds things or funds things in Africa. And if you have a perspective on project delivery that we haven't heard, we'd like to hear from you here at the African Catalyst. You can follow us on Instagram, connect with us on LinkedIn, and visit our website at theafricancatalyst.com. We will see you on the next episode of Making Infrastructure Happen. Thank you very much.